Welcome back to the Deep Dive, everyone. Today we're diving into a topic that I know a lot of you are interested in, and it's something that you, our listener, actually brought to our attention.
Yeah, this is great.
It was a really fascinating collection of research. We're going to be talking about the relationship between how we hear, how we process spoken language, and how that all ties into reading development.
Hmm.
Particularly why some people, even those with, typical intelligence, might struggle with reading.
Right, and it's so important to understand that
Yeah.
because it's not always obvious, right?
Right. So you sent over a ton of research that digs into, the foundational skills involved in learning to read, which is really interesting.
Yeah, a lot of it looks at, like, what are those building blocks
Right.
that have to be in place?
And so I guess the mission today is to really unpack these connections, how our hearing, our processing of speech sounds, all of that relates to, our reading abilities and I guess where those potential difficulties might come in.
Absolutely.
And hopefully this can kind of give us a new lens for understanding and maybe even addressing reading challenges, right?
Yeah, because if we know where those challenges originate, then maybe we can find better ways to support people who are struggling.
Exactly. Okay, so let's dive in now. The research you sent starts off with something I think a lot of people have heard of, which is the idea that reading difficulties, particularly dyslexia, often stem from what's called phonological impairment.
Mm-hmm.
Now, for those of us who, might not be as familiar with that term, what does that actually mean? What does phonological impairment mean?
So phonological impairment basically refers to difficulties with the sound structure of language.
Okay.
And, it manifests in different ways, but one really common example that your research pointed out is difficulty working with or combining those individual speech sounds, those phones. So, for example, someone with a phonological impairment might have trouble blending the B sound with the at sound to make the word bat. It's like those individual pieces aren't clicking into place for them.
Okay, so it's like they're hearing the sounds, but
I'm hearing them. They can't
Yeah.
Manipulate them.
Manipulate them or put them together.
Yeah.
Exactly.
Okay, interesting. And what's interesting is the research is really kind of delving into where these phonological difficulties come from.
Yeah.
Are they present from the beginning or do they develop later on?
Yeah, and scientists are really focusing now on those really early stages of how we process sounds and speech.
Okay.
So the idea is that maybe the roots of these phonological challenges actually lie in how we initially perceive and process like all auditory information, even before we're, you know, consciously trying to learn how to read,
Interesting. So maybe this is present even from, infancy.
potentially.
Yeah, okay.
And that leads us to these two key areas that your research highlighted,
Right.
which are general auditory perception and speech perception.
Right. So we're not just talking about hearing words, but how we process all kinds of sounds around us.
Okay, so break that down a little bit further for us.
So general auditory perception is our ability to process all the sounds, everything in our environment, not just speech.
Okay.
But speech perception is specifically how we decode and understand spoken words.
Okay.
And it seems that both of these areas are playing a role, the significant role, in how reading skills develop.
Got it. So let's zoom in a little bit on these two.
Yeah.
The research goes on to discuss something called segmental speech perception.
Right.
And it really focuses on phones, which are, as we've mentioned, the individual sounds that make up words.
Yeah, those building blocks.
Now, it seems like early research was particularly interested in a certain type of sound called stop consonants, which are like P, G, B, D, T.
Right.
Why the special focus on these?
Well, stop consonants are kind of unique for a couple of reasons. First, they're very rapid. They occur very quickly in speech, much faster than some other consonant sounds. And second, they have what we call transitional formants, which are these quick shifts in sound frequencies.
Okay.
So think about it like a musical instrument, how the pitch changes as you play different notes.
Right.
These rapid changes are what we call transitional formants, and our ears have to be able to hear those changes. So these features together, the rapidity and the transitional formants, can make stop consonants, potentially trickier for our auditory system to process.
Oh, so it's like they're the speedy sounds of language.
Yeah, you could say that.
Okay. And what did researchers find when they looked at how kids who struggle with reading, how they perceive these sounds?
What they found is that children with dyslexia often have less clear category boundaries for these stop consonants. It's
Yeah.
like their brains aren't drawing as sharp of a line between similar sounds. And sometimes they even show a heightened sensitivity to those tiny little variations within a sound category, which are called allophonic contrasts.
Okay. Allophonic contrast. Can you give us a more, like, concrete example of that?
Sure. So think about the T sound in the word top
Okay.
versus the T sound in stop.
Okay. Yeah.
So they're both technically the T phone.
Right.
But the way we actually produce that sound can be slightly different depending on the surrounding sounds.
Right. Yeah.
And usually we don't consciously notice those tiny differences, right?
Right.
But some research suggests that individuals with dyslexia might actually be more attuned to these minor variations, which can actually make it harder to group those sounds into, those neat phoneme categories.
Oh, so it's like they're almost too focused on the
Yeah, like
yeah,
too
the
focused on the tiny
details.
and they miss the bigger picture.
Okay, that makes sense. Now, the researcher also mentioned something called the temporal processing hypothesis.
hmm
What is that exactly?
So this hypothesis basically suggests that difficulties in perceiving these very rapid auditory transitions, those quick changes we talked about, might be a fundamental reason why some folks struggle with phonological awareness and then later with reading. Because if you can't process those sounds accurately, it can really mess with your ability to break down and manipulate those individual sounds in words.
Right. It's like if the sounds are coming at you too fast,
Now,
it's hard to kind of grab them and move them around there.
exactly. It's like trying to catch a bunch of marbles that are being thrown at you really quickly.
Yeah,
It's hard to, catch them all and put them in order.
right. But it sounds like this hypothesis hasn't been like universally accepted, right?
Right. There have been some criticisms of it.
Okay.
For example, not every kid who struggles with reading has difficulty with stop consonants.
Mm.
And some folks with reading disabilities struggle even with sounds that are, slowed down or that don't have those super rapid transitions.
Okay.
So it suggests that maybe the auditory challenges are more diverse than just this temporal processing piece.
Okay, so it's not like a simple, straightforward explanation for
Yeah.
everyone. Got it.
Mm.
But the research does say that, despite these criticisms, many studies do find that children with dyslexia often have trouble perceiving and working with stop consonants.
Absolutely. While it might not be the whole picture, those difficulties with segmental speech perception, especially those stop consonants, seem to be a big piece of the puzzle.
Okay, so we've talked about individual sounds,
Right.
but the research also looks at something called suprasegmental speech perception.
Mm-hmm.
And that sounds like we're going beyond those individual phones.
Exactly.
What is that?
So, suprasegmental perception is looking at those broader elements of speech, things like syllables, the rhythm of language, the stress patterns, the tone, intonation, and even things like onsets and rhymes within syllables.
Okay,
So, it's really about the melody and the beat of spoken language, if you will.
got it. So it's like taking a step back and looking at those bigger chunks of sound rather than those
Exactly.
zooming out.
Little units. Okay, and why is this broader level of processing so important for reading? Well, developmentally, kids actually master these bigger sound units like syllables before they get a handle on those finer details of phones.
Okay.
So it suggests that maybe if there are issues at this broader, the suprasegmental level,
Right.
it could actually have a knock-on effect and impact phonemic awareness later on.
Okay.
It's like learning the rhythm of a song before you try to figure out the individual notes.
That's a good analogy.
Yeah.
Now, the research mentions something called a metrical segmentation strategy that infants use.
Mm-hmm.
What's that?
So this is pretty cool. In languages like English, many content words, those important words tend to start with a stressed syllable.
Right.
So babies seem to pick up on this pattern, and they actually use that presence of that strong syllable as a clue to help them identify word boundaries in that constant stream of speech that they're hearing.
Oh, so it's like they're using that stress to kind of chunk the language into words.
Exactly, yeah. It's like a little signpost for where words might begin.
Interesting. And then, taking that a step further, if a child has difficulty with this strategy, it might make it harder for them to break down spoken language into those meaningful chunks, which could then affect their perception of those smaller units like phones later on.
Right, because it all builds on itself.
Right. Now, the research mentions Table 1, which outlines different tasks used to test this suprasegmental sensitivity. What are some examples of those tasks?
So there are things like metric stress tasks, which look at how well someone can perceive the stress patterns within words, and
Okay.
then rhythmic matching tasks, which look at that at a sentence level.
Okay.
So how well can they recognize and match rhythmic patterns in phrases or sentences?
Got it. And what are these tasks revealed about, the link between this kind of sensitivity and reading ability?
Well, one key finding is that folks who struggle with reading often don't do as well on those rhythmic matching tasks, even when you take their vocabulary knowledge into account. So it suggests that there's something specific about the ability to perceive and process that rhythm of language that's connected to reading ability.
Okay. The research also points out that metric stress, is associated with word reading and spelling in young children.
Right.
And it even mentions a study of 3-year-olds who were at risk for dyslexia, struggling with irregular stress in non-words,
hmm
which seems to, potentially point to an inherited component to all of this.
Right. And it's fascinating that they see these differences so early, even with made up words.
Right. So it's like it's not even about the words themselves. It's about this sensitivity to the
It's that,
pattern.
the underlying pattern.
Okay, so for those of us who speak English, stress might be the most obvious element of rhythm.
Sure.
But the research also goes into lexical tone, which is obviously super important for tonal languages like Mandarin.
Absolutely. Yeah.
How does that fit into this whole picture?
So in tonal languages, the pitch of a syllable actually changes the meaning of the word. So, the example they give is the syllable fu in Mandarin.
Right.
Depending on the tone, it can mean husband, float, rot, or rich.
Wow, so just changing the pitch completely changes the meaning.
Totally different meanings.
Okay. And what does the research tell us about this lexical tone perception and reading in those languages?
So, studies have shown that Cantonese-speaking kids with dyslexia actually struggle with identifying and categorizing those lexical tones.
Okay.
And even 5-year-olds who are at risk for dyslexia in tonal language environments have a harder time distinguishing tones.
Hmm.
And what's really interesting is that preschoolers' sensitivity to lexical tones can actually predict how well they'll be able to read Chinese characters later on,
Yeah.
even when you account for other things.
So it really emphasizes that, reading challenges aren't just about the alphabet. It's about the
Next.
sensitivity to the melody of language.
Exactly. It's a crucial piece of the puzzle, regardless of the writing system.
Okay. Now, the research kind of takes an interesting turn here. It suggests that maybe this poor phonological representation in dyslexia that we've been talking about might not just be about speech, but it could extend to like general rhythmic processing.
Right.
Things like amplitude modulation, frequency modulation.
Yeah.
So it seems like we're moving away from spoken language again.
Yeah, we're getting a little bit more abstract here.
Right.
So the idea is that maybe the difficulties that some people have with the rhythm of speech might actually reflect a broader insensitivity to rhythmic patterns in any kind of sound.
Oh.
So it's not just about speech. So just to remind everyone, amplitude modulation, that's about changes in loudness over time.
Right.
And frequency modulation, that's about changes in the pitch over time. And both of these, at these relatively slow rates, they're what contribute to what we perceive as the acoustic rhythm of a sound.
Okay, so our sensitivity to these rhythms in, any kind of sound, not just speech, could be important for reading.
Right, exactly.
Now, how do they typically assess sensitivity to these non-speech rhythmic patterns?
Right.
The research mentions Table 2 here.
Yeah, so Table 2 outlines some of the tasks,
Oh.
things like AM beat detection tasks, where people have to identify rhythmic patterns in tones that don't have any linguistic content.
Okay.
And there's the rise duration rove task, which is specifically looking at how quickly the loudness of a sound increases.
Right.
FM detection tasks look at the ability to hear changes in pitch.
Okay.
And then pitch contour tasks look at whether someone can recognize a melody even when you change the absolute pitches of the notes.
Got it. And what have they found using these tasks about people who have trouble reading?
So one of the big findings, especially with AM sensitivity, is that kids with dyslexia across different languages, English, French, Finnish, even adults with dyslexia,
Yeah.
they all tend to show this reduced sensitivity on AM beat detection tasks.
Mm-hmm.
And what's even more interesting is that one study found that a person's ability to detect those AM beats, it actually explained a big chunk of the variation in their word reading ability, even after you account for things like their age, their IQ, their vocabulary.
Wow, so that's a pretty strong connection.
Right. It suggests that even this seemingly basic ability to detect rhythm in non-speech sounds is really important for reading.
Okay. And the research even mentions something called the P-center theory to try to explain this link.
Yeah, this is a fascinating theory.
What is that?
So the P-center theory, proposed by Usha Goswami, suggests that the way we perceive those stressed beats, or P centers, it's largely determined by how we process that amplitude modulation at relatively slow rates.
Okay.
And then the theory goes on to suggest that our sensitivity to these P centers is important for how we represent those onset rhyme segments within syllables.
Hmm.
So, that's the initial consonant sound, the onset, and then the vowel in any following consonants, the rhyme.
Nice.
So it's almost like a direct pathway from how we perceive that rhythm in the sound
Yeah.
to how we break down words into their parts, which is
Uh-huh.
crucial for reading.
Okay. So being sensitive to those rhythmic patterns in the amplitude envelope might help us break down syllables, and that then affects our awareness of rhymes, and ultimately it affects our reading.
Exactly.
That's interesting. Now, the research also mentions some findings about FM sensitivity, noting that Norwegian-speaking poor readers showed higher detection thresholds,
Right.
which indicates rhythmic insensitivity even in a language with a pretty transparent orthography, and where the spelling matches the sounds pretty closely.
Right. So even in a language where you might think reading would be more straightforward, those underlying rhythmic processing skills seem to play a role.
Okay, so we've looked at both those detailed sounds, those individual sounds, and that broader level of rhythm and stress.
Right.
Now, the research asks, a pretty crucial question. How do these two levels of speech perception, the segmental and the suprasegmental, how do they relate to each other?
Yeah, how do they all fit together?
Right. So are they totally separate, or is there some connection?
Well, the research shows that there are definitely connections.
Uh-huh.
There are moderate to strong associations between our sensitivity to speech prosody, those suprasegmental features, and phonological awareness.
Right.
So how well we can manipulate sounds.
But I guess, the even bigger question is, does that suprasegmental sensitivity contribute to reading independently of phonological awareness?
Right. So beyond just being able to work with sounds, does that sensitivity to prosody matter on its own?
Right.
And it seems like the answer is yes.
Yep.
Studies have shown that things like metric stress awareness can actually predict how well a child will read even after you account for their ability to, delete phones or work with rhymes.
Interesting.
So it suggests that maybe that sensitivity to the rhythm and melody of language is influencing reading in ways that go beyond just being aware of the individual sounds.
Okay. So if it's not just about phonological awareness, then what are some of those potential pathways from prosody to reading?
Well, the research suggests a few possibilities.
Right.
One is through what we call lexicon access, which is how quickly and easily we can retrieve words from our mental dictionary.
Right.
So prosodic cues might actually help us recognize familiar words faster.
Okay, that makes sense.
Another possibility is through short-term memory.
Okay.
So those prosodic cues like stress and intonation might help us organize and store verbal information better.
Okay.
And then a third really interesting possibility is through morphological awareness,
Okay.
which is our understanding of how words are built from smaller units of meaning, those morphemes.
Mhm.
And in some languages, changes in stress or tone can actually signal grammatical information or word structure.
Oh, interesting.
Like, in English, active versus activity.
Right.
That change in stress signals something about the grammar.
Right.
And in tonal languages, those changes in tone can even indicate different morphemes. Okay, so being sensitive to those changes can help us with word structure and meaning, which is, of course, super important for reading.
Yeah. So it seems like that melody of language might be giving us more information than we even realize when we're reading.
It might be, yeah.
Now, the research also brings up this question of whether suprasegmental sensitivity is linked to reading independently of segmental sensitivity.
Right.
So, our ability to perceive those individual phones.
Yeah, so does prosody matter even if you're good at working with individual sounds?
Exactly. And it seems like the answer is probably yes.
Yeah, the research seems to point in that direction.
Okay.
And one of the arguments for that is that suprasegmental processing, particularly its connection to morphological awareness,
Right.
might be influencing reading through a different route than phonological awareness, which is more tied to that segmental processing.
Okay.
And also, developmentally, kids pick up on those prosodic patterns earlier. And there's even this idea that early sensitivity to prosody might actually help the development of segmental perception later on.
Oh, interesting. So it's almost like a bootstrapping process.
It could be. Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah.
Now, the research then delves into a long-standing debate in the field, which is is reading disability primarily due to what's called a speech-specific deficit,
Right.
or is it rooted in a more general auditory impairment?
Yeah, that's a big question.
So it's like, is it specifically about speech sounds, or is it about processing any kind of sound?
Right.
And we've looked at these two kind of seemingly opposite views.
Mhm.
And what's fascinating is that the research also presents a model that tries to integrate these two
Yeah,
views.
trying to bridge the gap.
Yeah. So let's unpack that a little bit. First, can you just kind of recap for us, the core arguments for each of those perspectives? So what are the arguments for that speech-specific view?
So the speech-specific deficit hypothesis argues that the difficulties are mainly in processing speech sounds. And there's some evidence for that.
Okay.
For example, some studies have shown that people with dyslexia might actually be better at telling the difference between sounds within a phoneme category,
Okay.
but they have more trouble distinguishing sounds across categories.
Mm.
So it's like they're having trouble with that linguistic categorization of sounds, not just a basic auditory issue.
Okay.
And there are studies that have directly compared how people discriminate speech sounds versus non-speech sounds.
Right.
And they found that poor readers really only had trouble with those speech sounds.
Okay.
And even some brain imaging studies using ERPs have shown differences in brain responses to speech sounds, but not non-speech sounds in people with dyslexia.
Okay, so there's definitely some evidence there.
Right.
But then what about the arguments for a more general auditory impairment?
So on that side, there's research showing that some individuals with dyslexia have delays in auditory perception across both language-related and non-language-related sounds. And there are these fascinating longitudinal studies that have actually tracked brain responses from, babies all the way to school age.
Wow.
And what they found is that early responses to both auditory and non-auditory stimuli can actually predict later reading skills.
Mm.
And there are other ERP studies that have found similar links between early brain responses to both speech and non-speech sounds and later decoding skills.
Okay.
And these findings have actually been seen in kids learning different kinds of writing systems, too.
Okay, so it's not just about, alphabets.
Right.
It's about something more general.
Yeah, it seems like that early sensitivity to sound in general might be important.
Okay. So we have evidence for both sides.
Mm-hmm.
The research points out a methodological challenge in resolving this debate, which is that comparing groups at one point in time might miss some of those developmental links.
Right?
What do they mean by that?
So the idea is that even if we don't see a difference between, dyslexic and non-dyslexic individuals in general auditory processing, when we test them at, say, age 8, right, it's possible that there were differences earlier on that played a role in how their speech perception developed, right, which then went on to affect their reading.
Okay. So it's like we need to look at the whole developmental trajectory, not just one point in time.
Exactly.
And then it also seems like the type of auditory tasks used in these studies can make a difference.
Yeah, definitely. Different tasks tap into different aspects of auditory processing.
Right.
Like we talked about before, temporal versus rhythmic processing.
Right.
And these different tasks can actually show independent links to phonological awareness and reading,
Mm.
which suggests that they might be measuring different things.
Okay.
And some researchers even think that maybe temporal processing is more related to attention, while rhythmic processing is more about, just detecting the stimulus.
Interesting. So it's not as simple as just saying auditory processing. It's more nuanced than that.
It is, yeah.
And the research also points out that the difficulty level of the sounds used in these tasks can matter too. It suggests that maybe we only see those differences between groups when the sounds are harder to process.
Yeah, because if it's too easy, everyone might do well, and we won't see those subtle differences in how their brains are working.
Right. It's like we need to kind of push the system a little bit to see where those breakdowns might occur.
Exactly.
Okay, so given all of this complexity, the research proposes this new model, this integrated model that says maybe those two hypotheses aren't mutually exclusive.
Right.
Maybe it's not just one or the other.
It's both.
Yeah. So can you walk us through this model and how it tries to bring all of these pieces together?
Sure. So this model proposes a 4-stage developmental pathway.
Okay.
And it starts with auditory sensitivity in stage 1.
Okay.
And that includes both temporal and rhythmic processing.
Right.
And the model suggests that these sensitivities are, partly genetic, and we see individual differences in them right from birth.
Okay.
And then stage 2 is the impact on speech perception. So that's where that temporal sensitivity is thought to influence how we perceive those individual phonemes.
Right.
And the rhythmic sensitivity influences how we perceive those suprasegmental features, that prosody.
Okay.
And interestingly, the model also suggests that speech prosody can actually influence how we perceive those individual sounds too.
Oh, interesting. So there's kind of a feedback loop there.
Yeah, it's not just a one-way street.
Okay. And then stage 3 is the pathways to literacy acquisition.
Right.
So that's where those segmental and suprasegmental sensitivities start to really impact reading development.
Exactly.
So on the segmental side, that influences things like phonological awareness, rapid automatized naming, verbal short-term memory.
Mm-hmm.
And then on the suprasegmental side, it influences phonological processing and also morphological awareness.
Right.
And then finally, we get to stage 4, which is reading skills.
The end goal.
Yeah, the outcome of all of this. So you can really see how this model tries to connect those early sensitivities to sound all the way through to those reading outcomes.
Yeah, it's a really comprehensive view.
Yeah. Now, the research does mention some potential criticisms of this model.
Mm-hmm.
One of them is this idea of combining rhythmic and temporal processing into one factor.
Right.
Why keep them separate in the model?
Well, the argument for keeping them separate is that they can be independently linked to reading skills.
Okay.
And also, some folks with reading difficulties might have trouble with one but not the other.
Right.
So it suggests that they're distinct aspects of auditory processing.
Okay, so they're related, but they're not the same thing.
Right.
And then another critique is about separating segmental and suprasegmental processing.
Right.
Why are those considered distinct factors?
Because it seems like they might influence reading in different ways.
Okay.
So segmental processing more through phonological awareness,
Right.
suprasegmental processing more through morphological awareness.
Got it.
And they also develop at different times.
Right.
So they're both important, but they seem to be contributing in unique ways.
Okay. And then the final critique is about whether auditory sensitivity is directly influencing reading, alongside speech perception, rather than kind of coming forward and influencing it.
Right.
What's the model's response to that?
So the model proposes that early auditory perception really lays the foundation for speech perception.
Okay.
It's rare to find someone who has big problems with basic auditory processing who doesn't also have issues with speech.
Right.
So the model is suggesting that auditory sensitivity comes first, and it shapes how speech perception develops, which then goes on to impact reading.
Okay, so it's kind of a cascade of effects.
It is. It's like a chain reaction.
Okay. So this model seems to offer a pretty valuable framework for understanding how reading develops and where those difficulties might come in.
It does.
The research even highlights its theoretical significance, mentioning how it could help explain things like bilingual phonological transfer and identify universal reading factors across different languages.
Yeah, it gives us a broader perspective.
What do they mean by those things?
So, for example, there's this finding that how well a person can match tones in Chinese can actually predict how well they'll read in English.
Oh, wow.
And the model suggests that this might be because of an underlying shared sensitivity to those rhythmic patterns.
Interesting.
And then the importance of AM sensitivity for that onset rhyme segmentation. That seems to be a universal factor across different languages and